Привет. I'm Chuck Olenek, a Ukrainian-American who was baptized with the name Yaroslav, which is also the name I use in the historical reenactment group, the Society for Creative Anachronism. Well, I decided that after staring at many notebooks on Slavic mythology and folklore and on early Rus history, that I would put these on video and make them more accessible to people in the society who might want to be looking at doing Eastern European personae. So I've been retelling some of the tales and putting them up on my YouTube channel, which, by the way, would be really nice if you subscribe to it. And a number of these tales involve the bogatiri, or bogatirs, who are the heroes. It's sort of like instead of King Arthur, you have Prince Volodymyr, Fair Sun or Red Sun. And instead of Camelot, it's Kyiv. And instead of the Knights of the Round Table, it's the bogatiri, who you have a Lancelot equivalent, Ilya Mirom, and there's adventures that these bogatiri have. And other than the elder bogatiri and the younger bogatiri, there's another category that were out-of-towners or mercenaries, and a lot of these characters kind of got added to Volodymyr's court as you kind of give up on the Kievan Rus period, and towns like Novgorod and Polotsk and Moscow are growing. And so during this Moscow era, there's a bunch of new characters that have been added. And Churilo is one of these. In the case of Churilo Plenkovich, he comes from Suroj, which is on the Crimean Peninsula, and his father, Plenko, was, I guess, a silk merchant or a trader. Now, unlike other bogatirs, Churilo is a fop, an old Russian Don Juan, and the tales describe him as having skin like snow and eyes like a falcon's and eyebrows black as sable. And to keep his complexion so fair, he actually has a servant following him around with a parasol to protect him from the sun. Apparently he was more respectful of women than a lot of the bogatirs, and was very mindful of the type of language that he used. But there's kind of a contrast here, because Churilo at some point is going to get killed by a jealous husband. So there's got to be a story there. And that brings us to the tale of Churilo Plenkovich the Fop. Who would tell us of the things of old, and of the things that have been, of Churilo, the son of Plenko, of Churilo the Fop? Volodymyr, Prince of royal Kyiv town, ate, drank, and made merry, and heeded not the petitions of his people, who came to him by the hundreds, all beaten and sore, their tempestuous heads bound with girdles for cudgel blows. They also did lowly reverence to bright Prince Volodymyr, and made complaint of how 500 youths had fished the rivers and royal ponds bare, of how 1,000 men who rode hither and thither, catching bright sparrowhawks and white noble falcons, leaving none for the prince, and how these men, who had assaulted and wounded those who sought the succor of the prince, were called Churilo's bodyguard. While the falconers still stood in the royal presence, came merchants and gardeners, and told how Churilo's wild druzhina, his wild guards, had plucked all their garlic and onions, broken all their white cabbages, and insulted all the young damsels and the young men of Kyiv. The word touched Prince Volodymyr, and he inquired of them at last, "Who is this Churilo?" Old Bermiag Vasilievich stepped forth. "Lord, I have known Churilo this long while. He dwelleth not in Kyiv, but in little Kyiv. His palace covereth 7 versts. About it standeth an iron fence. Upon each paling thereof is a knob, and that knob is of pure round pearl. In the midst of the courtyard stand halls, chambers of white oak, hung with gray beaver skins, and the ceilings thereof are hung with black sables, and the center beam is covered with leather. The floor of his bower, the space above the oven, is of pure silver, the hooks and hasps of damascene steel. His first gates are of carven oak, the second all crystal, the third of tin. All his thresholds are of precious fishes' teeth, and all his ovens of tiles." When Volodymyr heard that, he arrayed himself in haste and commanded a journey. With him he took his princess, his nobles and mighty heroes, Dobrynya Nikitich and old Bermiag Vasilievich, summoned 500 men, and set out for Churilo Plenkovich's court. Old Plenko himself came to greet his visitors. For the prince and princess, he opened his gates of carved work. For the princes and nobles, those gates that were of crystal. For the common folk, the tin gates. Then old Plenko, the silk merchant, led Volodymyr and Princess Apraxia to a richly patterned chamber, to another of crystal, and a third of lattice work, and so to the golden domed tower, where all was heavenly with sun and moon and stars innumerable and white dawns. In the fair hall he seated them at tables richly decked, and assigned fitting places to the princes and nobles. Then the cunning cooks fetched sweet viands and mead and all sorts of liquors from beyond the sea to give mirth to the princes. Joyful was their converse, and cheerful the day. Prince Volodymyr, fair son, pulled aside the little lattice window by which he sat with his princess, and as they gazed forth upon the open steppe, they saw a goodly 100 youths come riding from afar, from Mother Soroga River. The youths' good steeds were all matched in color, their bits alike of bronze, their caftans all of scarlet cloth and streaming girdles. Prince Volodymyr inquired of Plenko whether this was his son, and the old silk merchant replied, "No, these be Churilo's cooks, they make his green wine." When that throng had entered the court, another 500 came riding from the steppe, all alike in their steeds and in their apparel. Again, Volodymyr inquired of Plenko, "Is this Churilo and his druzhina?" And old Plenko made answer that these were but Churilo's stewards who served the table. When this troop had entered, a third, 1,000 strong, came from afar, and in their midst a goodly youth, fairer than they all. His locks were like a field of gold, his neck like the white snows, his cheeks outdid the poppy in hue. Like the clear falcons gleamed his eyes, his brows were like black sables. From horse to horse sprang the fair youth, from the third horse past the fourth, hurling high his spear to heaven, as if it had been a swan's feather, and catching it hand over hand. "A misfortune hath come upon me for my sins," cried Volodymyr. "Lo, I am far from home, and there rideth hither to me a king from the horde, or some threatening ambassador, to sue for my fair niece Zabava beauty." But old Plenko poured him a cup of wine, saying, "Fear not, Prince Volodymyr, 'tis but my son Churilo with his druzhina. When he stand before thee, Lord, this feast will be but half a feast. This banquet will seem poor." They all began to eat and drink and make merry, sitting without thought or care. In the court the white day had drawn to even, the fair red sun was sunk in the west, ere Churilo arrived. And yet before him was borne a canopy, that the sun might not scorch his white face. Old Plenko went to the railed balcony behind the hall and cried, "Ay, Churilo Plenkovich, thou hast here in thy hall a much-loved guest, fair son Volodymyr of royal Kyiv. What wilt thou now set before him? What gifts bestow upon him?" Now Churilo was quick-witted and crafty. He took his golden keys, went to his iron-bound coffers, and drew thence great treasure of black sables and a mantle of precious sables, soft and feathery, beneath rich samite from beyond the sea, for Prince Volodymyr. Fine white damask in value 100,000 hryvnia for the Princess Apraxia. To each noble he gave little foxes of the cavern, to every merchant marten skins, and to the common folk much gold. Volodymyr accepted these gifts and said, "Though the complaints against Churilo were many, yet are his offerings still greater. And now I will not give judgment against him." And to Churilo he said, "Young Churilo Plenkovich, it is not fitting that thou shouldst dwell in the country. Wilt thou not come to Kyiv town and serve as a seneschal and cupbearer?" Though some buy off misfortune, Churilo purchased ill luck at great cost. Yet he rebelled not, but ordered them to saddle his steed in haste, and all rode back to Kyiv town, royal Kyiv town, so that all the maids and wives gazed and marveled as they passed through the streets. Then that bright lord, Prince Volodymyr, fair sun, red sun, made a great feast for his new steward. Churilo laid the oaken tables, and he shook back his golden curls. And as he shook back his curls, they fell apart like fair round pearls that do roll asunder. And his young Princess Apraxia was carving the swan. She cut her right hand, and said, "Marvel not at this, ye gentlewomen, for I gaze upon Churilo's beauty, upon his yellow curls, his golden ring, and my clear eyes are troubled. Fair my lord, Prince Volodymyr, make Churilo thy groom of the chambers. Let him spread the downy feather bed, place the high cushion, and sit by thy pillow to play upon his guzli of maple wood and solace thee." Then princely Volodymyr told Churilo that thus it must be. For some buy off misfortune, but Churilo purchased his. So he performed the varied service of groom of the chambers, to the great solace of Prince Volodymyr and his princess, young Apraxia. When Volodymyr made a feast, he sent young Churilo to bid the princes and nobles, and from each guest he commanded him to take 10 hryvnia for himself. And as the goodly youth passed through the streets of royal Kyiv town upon his errand, shaking back his yellow curls like fair round pearls, nuns turned in their cells to gaze upon his beauty. Young maids tore off their kokoshniks in admiration. Then the Princess Apraxia spoke to courteous Prince Volodymyr. "Fair lord, this service befitteth Churilo not." Volodymyr perceived that misfortune was come upon him, and spoke this word then to Churilo: "Dwell thou in a cell, Churilo Plenkovich, or depart now to thine own house, for in my palace I have no longer need of thee." Then Churilo bowed low in reverence, and went forth from the palace, from royal Kyiv town, and came to the Puchai river, where he began again to dwell in mirth and pleasure. It was at the feast I heard this tale. There it was, I drank mead ale. Though it flowed down my beard, my mouth stayed dry, for never a drop passed my lips, swear I.